Okay, well, hey, welcome to CTC. I thought I'd give you guys just a little bit of an update on what I'm doing now. Most of you know that I worked for Ohio State University for 24 years, and then I left and went to work for the government, USDA, NRCS as a soil health specialist. So I stopped doing that in September 13th, and now I've started my own company. So I'll just tell you a little bit real quick what I'm doing. Well, I'll first tell you this. My wife asked me, she said, Jim, are you going to make enough money doing soil health services? I said, give me 6 months, okay? About 2 months later, she wagged her finger at me and said, Jim, you need to slow down. You can't be working on Saturdays and Sundays all the time, okay? So business has really been good. I do 6 things. I teach. I'm getting paid to teach, not today, but I do generally get paid for that. I do consulting. We also got lucky. We got a grant. We got a $659,000 grant. That is going to supply me with about 80% of my salary that I was making. And so good news for you folks, if you're in the Maumee watershed, you can call me and talk to me for free. If you're outside the watershed, then there's a fee. It's just the way it goes, guys. I got to make some money. The other thing I do is I sell cover crop seed. I also sell the disc blades. We got our display out there, and we're selling the I&J crop roller. Okay, so now you know what's going on with me. We are writing a bunch of grants, and so I'm now even to the point where I'm starting to hire people to help do the grants because I just can't do all the work ourselves. So that's what we're doing. What's the topic today? We're going to talk a little bit about the cover crops and the preventive planting. That's the first part of the presentation. And I'm sorry, but we probably messed up. I see this as CM, and that's probably had an effect on most of the people that are here. But actually, we're going to be talking quite a bit about nutrient management and soil and water. So I don't know, unfortunately, when they send these things in for credits, we don't always get it. So let's get started. Here's what we're going to talk about. One of the problems we have is a lot of guys didn't plant a cover crop last year. Now, if you planted a cover crop, you're not going to have this fallow or what we call sour soil syndrome, and we'll describe what that is in just a little bit. We're going to talk about these wet springs. Is that just a fad or is that just a new trend? And if it's a new trend, how's that going to change your farming? Okay? And so I'm actually going to use some of Stuart Dykard's slides, but I'm going to use them in a little bit different way than what he did, okay? We'll talk about soil compaction, that structural stability. We're going to talk about this broken carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus cycle, okay? And we'll get into a little bit about how soil organic matter is like your mom, okay? She just really takes care of everything, and just a little bit on that. And then we'll get into some of the nitrogen and phosphorus and actually potassium losses that we're seeing in the soil. We'll explain what's going on, why that's going. So this fallow soil syndrome, what's it about? Well, it occurs when you don't have a live crop out there. So if you didn't plant anything last year, absolutely nothing. We see this. It's related to phosphorus deficiency and also zinc. Okay, so those are the two primary things that you need to look at. If you had a cover crop out there, you generally don't have to worry about it. But if you had really bad conditions, we'll talk about that. You might see some examples of that, okay? How much can this hurt you? Up to about 15% of your corn yield. And they've seen anywhere from 0 to 32 bushel losses in corn, okay? So here's what it looks like. All right, that's that purple corn syndrome, okay? Now, interesting thing, I have some plots that I started in Putnam County on the Sharp site. Okay, we have long-term no-till with cover crops, and we have conventional soil, okay? This was all in like CRP for 20 years. We are now seeing phosphorus deficiency wherever we have that conventional soil. Why is that? Because it's related to the mycorrhizae. The mycorrhizae are bringing back 6 times more phosphorus to that plant, and if you don't have a live plant out there, it can't complete its life cycle in a year, and so we're seeing that these symptoms are showing up. Guess what? On our plots, we can see where we've done the conventional tillage for the last 4 to 5 years. That corn is shorter and it's more purple, especially when we have wet springs, okay? Because we're not completing the life cycle. A lot of these mycorrhizae, they go anywhere from 5 months to 9 months. Okay, to complete their life cycle. Now, some of them can get it completed in 5 months, but they still have to have a live crop out there. And if you have nothing growing out there, they do on a few weeds, but it's got to be a grassy weed. Most of the weeds are non-mycorrhizae. Okay, so that's where we're seeing this problem. And it's due to those fallow soils and a lack of mycorrhizae. Okay, so here's what's going on. These mycorrhizae, there's 150 to 200 species, 250 species, and they all do a little bit something different. But the majority of them, it seems like that phosphorus is a big one. Okay, these mycorrhizae can actually make phosphorus from the mineralogy in the soil. So they can take it from the iron and the aluminum and make it soluble and make it plant available, okay? But generally, that's not soluble reactive phosphorus that we have to worry about getting out into our tile lines, because they're taking it in and they're feeding it to the plant. And it's going to be tied up organically, okay? So we don't need to worry about that part of it until maybe it decomposes, okay? So what are these doing? These are your mycorrhizae. A corn plant by itself can explore 1% of the soil volume, but when you have these mycorrhizae, they can explore 20%. So what these mycorrhizae will do is they'll go into a root, and they can extend out 6 to even as much as 18 inches. And not only can they extend out, they expand out how much volume of soil that we can get this phosphorus from, and they greatly enhance the phosphorus uptake into that plant. They can also attach to multiple plants, so they can go right down the row if you have non-disturbed soils. They've got this network out there, and they'll attach to multiple plants, and what happens? The plant feeds it sugar, and these mycorrhizae in exchange will give zinc and phosphorus, water, and other micronutrients back to that plant, okay? So that's what's going on with the mycorrhizae. All right, what's your soil health solution? Well, if you didn't plant anything yet, and you had a bare soil all summer, do you have time to do something? The answer is yes. The best cover crops to plant would be something like oats, sorghum sudan, which is highly mycorrhizal, cereal rye, or legumes like winter peas, crimson clover, Valencia, hairy vetch, cowpeas. Now, some of those are summer annuals, so really about the only ones you're going to be able to plant this time of year might be the oats, the winter peas, maybe a few of the lentils, okay? And that can get that mycorrhizal network reestablished so that when you plant green into your cover crop, your corn will have a head start and you won't see the phosphorus, okay? So that's one of the things we can do. Things that you want to avoid planting, or you got to be a little careful. If you put a whole field of cover crops out last year and all you planted was the brassicas, the kale, the rape, the turnips, the radish, okay? You could see a 5 to 10 bushel yield decrease this year if that's all you planted was brassicas. Why? Because the brassicas are non-mycorrhizal. So you have to be a little bit careful, and even if you've got a mixture, it may depend on how big that mixture is. If you're really dominated by these brassicas, you could see a little bit of a yield hit, okay? We know of a case where one year the guy planted a fairly high rate of kale and might have put some rape in there and planted cereal rye. He took about a 5-10 bushel yield decrease, okay, on his corn the next year. We associated most of that due to having too much of the brassica. Now, as long as you don't have too many of them, if you got some other ones out there, as long as they're no more than maybe a third of the mixture, you're probably okay. And you should be able to, if you've got other things out there that are highly mycorrhizal, you can make up for it, okay? So it takes a little while for these networks to get reestablished. What if I'm doing conventional soils? What's your solution? Well, I hate to tell you, but what the research shows is you got to put on twice as much phosphorus as you would normally, okay? So you might have to put on some starter phosphorus and some chelated zinc. You might put it on as a pop-up. They would recommend you band that 2 inches by 2 inches, maybe put on 5 to 10 gallons of that 1034O. Okay, and then maybe 30 pounds of pea have been recommended. In some cases, one guy is recommending 60 to 80 pounds. Okay, and the other thing I will tell you is sometimes we're even seeing this, though, in fields that have high phosphorus levels. So just because you have high phosphorus, is it a plant available? That's the real key to what's going on. Okay, so these are some solutions that you might look at. Manage and cover crops, planting green. I put this one up because a lot of guys are having a lot of different questions. We've got all this biomass out there. How are we going to be able to do it? Well, we've got really 3 different ways to do it with the corn, okay? The corn can be somewhat of an issue. First of all, if you're planting corn into cereal rye, you got to think about what type of cereal rye you're putting out. Now, most of us don't know because most of the time it's VNS, variety not stated. But if you happen to plant a variety that has low allelopathic effect, you'll have a lot less problems than if you plant one into a cereal rye variety that has high. Now, most of the time they don't list that, and you have no idea what you're getting. But there are certain varieties that we can get that will be non-allelopathic. So, first of all, one way to do this is to kill it early. Okay, why do we want to kill it early? This is one example. It's not the only example, but this is one way to handle it. Well, if you kill it early, you need to kill it 3 weeks before you're going to plant. Why? We want to avoid that microbial bridge, okay? What happens is when you plant cereal rye, you kill it, and it grows up, and then you kill it, and then you kill that about the same time you plant the corn. The microbes can't tell the difference between the corn and the decaying cereal rye, so when they eat up all the cereal rye, what do they turn to? Something that's very similar, and pretty soon we start to get some problems in your corn. So if you do 3 weeks, those cycles will have peaked and they will have fallen back down. Then you plant your corn. Your corn can come up, get a really quick start. The soils will be a little bit warmer. They can grow fast. They can grow out of it. They won't have a problem. So that's strategy number 1. Strategy number 2 is planting into a legume, or it could be a legume brassica combination. You know, winter peas with radish works very well, okay? Or even having some oats in there. That is another way of doing it. You can plant green into that if there's anything live there, and then you can wait till your cover crop's up. You can even get it up to V4, and I like to use the roller, okay? Maybe it's just because we're selling them now, but that really works well. You don't have to use a herbicide. You got a nice soil structure there. It's going to help you with your weeds. The third option would be then to plant green, but if you're going to plant it into a grass, you plant into it, you let it get up, and it seems like we have less problems in cereal rye if we plant green into it, let it grow, let it get up to that V4, and then roll it down. And the reason being is you're just giving time for that plant to grow before you kill the cereal rye. The more growth you have on that corn, the better it is. What we're finding out is that corn is very flexible up to about V4. Once you get past V4, then you can damage it. So you want to kill it by then. For soybeans, the best way is to plant green into the grass cover crop unless it gets really dry. Haven't seen that for a couple years now, so I'm not really too concerned about that. It looks like we're going to have enough wet spring. Why do you want to plant into it? Because that cereal rye is going to promote some predators that take out Rhizoctonia and Pythium. And so it really helps. The other thing is those beans will get up off the ground that when you go to harvest them, you're not pushing soil. The first nodules will be a couple inches off the ground. They're a lot easier to harvest. Then you can roll it, and then you let the beans come up. The beans can be actually 4, 5, 6 inches tall, we're finding out, and you can roll those, maybe no more than 6. I'd say maybe about 4 to 5 is about as high as you want to go. And you can roll it, and now you've got a nice mat there. You're going to keep the soil temperatures off of it. The beans just love it. You're getting phosphorus from that cereal rye. It's working out really well, okay? So that's that planting green. Come back. So what do you want to avoid? You got to be careful on the herbicides, especially on annual ryegrass. If you put any annual ryegrass out there, you can see that glyphosate is better by itself rather than putting it in with something else. So be a little bit concerned about that. We've got a number of different varieties there. If you did use annual ryegrass, make sure you only use one variety, because what happens is if you use three, one will die out, one will grow like crazy, and the one that's half dead, half alive, that's the one that'll become your worst nightmare. So be a little bit careful with that. There's a whole series of things that you need to do if you're planting annual ryegrass. So Mike Plummer did most of the research on that. Make sure you look up Mike, and he will tell you all the things you need to do to make sure that that's going to work out well. Here's that crop roller. This is what we're using to terminate it, so that's another way. You can always use this. If you don't get all of it killed, you can always go back and make a second spray, maybe for any escapes, but this is working out well for a lot of farm. What are some other issues that we got to be concerned about? Well, the last 2 years we've had really 2 tough winters. It got really cold, and the voles and slug populations did what? They went way down. Okay, so here's what happens on the slugs. The slugs dig deep into the soil, and when the water table comes up and the frost layer comes down and those two meet, you knock out your slug populations. That happens about every 2 to 5 years. So our slug populations in general should be fairly low. But again, remember, we had kind of a light winter here. We had a lot of cover crops we put out early. We've had wet, moist conditions. They're in the building mode. What about the voles? The voles love the exact same conditions. Vole populations go way down in the winter. When we have tough winters, it takes 40% more energy for them to survive, okay? So the last 2 winters were tough. This winter, they're already breeding, okay? They're starting to have their babies. What's the best way to get rid of voles? Well, I talked to a guy up in Michigan. He bought himself 3 rat terriers. 3 rat terriers took out 250 voles in 2 hours. Okay? Now, one problem, you won't have a field that's no longer no-till because they'll have dug the whole thing up. Okay? One other thing you will not want to do, don't let your wife get too close to that dog, because just remember what that dog was killing just a few hours before. Okay? Those dogs like to lick everybody. Okay? So don't need to be spreading any germs around her. But these rat terriers, if you got a problem with voles, that's the best thing that I've found yet. This guy started a whole business with this, and it's an easy way to get rid of some if you've got a problem, okay? Other pests, we may have some true armyworms, some cutworm, okay? I'm going to leave that a little bit to tomorrow. We're going to have Curtis Young out here. He's going to talk about some of these things. But what we're finding out is that when these fly in, they're looking for fields. They're looking at the radio frequencies. They're actually using the infrared. And anytime you have a field that's really green, they're attracted to that, okay? But they're also attracted to what? They're attracted to plants that are a little sick. So if you have healthy fields, they will probably pass you over, but they might go to the neighbor, okay? And you got to be a little bit concerned about some of the armyworm. One of the things I've learned about armyworm, I have a fact sheet on there, is probably one of the best ways is if you see them coming, just spread some insecticide on the road or right along the edge before they get to your field, and you can take out a bunch of them, okay? If you can actually see them, you can hear them when they're really thick. We had a couple cases of it last year. Might be a little bit of a problem. One of the things that you're going to need to do, though, is have the right equipment, okay? So make sure look at your parts on your planters. You got to have sharp discs. We're finding out that if we plant maybe 2 to 3 inches deeper, if possible, we get better root structure. These crops grow a little bit better. We have less problems, okay? Now, 2019 was a wet spring. Something that one of my farmers told me, I'm not telling you you might want to try this. He says, we weren't able to get any beans planted, but we tried something. He says, it was so wet. He says, we just went and broadcasted a whole acre of soybeans. How much do you think those soybeans made? Well, with all the rain we had, he said we made 55 to 60 bushel beans off of that. Now, I'm not telling you that that's what you're going to have to do this next year, but might be something that we have to think think. We're going to have to think outside the box if this is going to continue. What else is going on? Well, do you realize that the last couple years, the last 4 years, are in the top 10 for the wettest Ohio springs on record? Is this a new trend or is it just a fad? Well, what we're seeing is that, we used to get 32 to 32 inches. The last 4 years, we're averaging right around 50 inches, and the long-term climatologists are saying we could be going to 60. So how's that going to change your farming? Well, we're going to have a longer growing season, but we might actually have about 5, maybe up to 10 days less to get things planted in the spring. And we may have 5 to 10 days less in the fall. Look at what happened last year. It just seems like sometimes these seasons are a little out of whack. Seems like spring just lasted a long time. We didn't get planted till June, and yet we had guys harvesting in November and December. Makes it hard to get the cover crop planted, okay? So we're going to have to find different ways to make this work. So that's kind of what I'm going to transition into next. But first of all, I want to talk about this, because this is one of my pet peeves, having worked with NRCS. Do you guys realize that the average soil erosion rate in this country is 7.6 tons? Okay, 7.6 tons per acre. That's 15,200 pounds. What's the average soybean yield? Average soybean yields are right around 50 bushels. If you take that times 60, that's 60 pounds. Our loss ratio for every pound of soybean that we produce is 5 pounds of topsoil is lost. Every 1 pound of soybean equals 5 pounds of topsoil lost on average in the United States. Is that sustainable? My question is, are we in the mining business? And by and large, a lot of us are. Now, the numbers for Ohio are what? 2.6 tons. We lose on average about 1.7 to 1.8 pounds of topsoil for every 1 pound of soybeans that we produce. I think we're going to have to figure out a way, especially with this increased rainfall, we're going to have to find a way to keep that soil in place, okay? So, this is Seward Dykers. You already seen this, okay? And the reason I'm using this is because it talks about structural stability. If you had a choice and there was a 2-inch rainfall, would you go across a freshly tilled soil? If it was pouring down rain, would you drive across a freshly tilled soil, or would you find a soil that's been in pasture and has some live roots in it? Well, we all know that the pasture will hold us up, okay? So just look at the structural stability. The one in the right-hand corner is same truck. That's a foot deep, okay? That was tilled, okay? The one in the left-hand bottom corner is 1 year no-till. What did he tell us? About 5 to 6 inches deep those ruts are. After 2 years, how deep are the ruts? About 2 inches, okay? And on the long-term no-till, those ruts, you can't hardly even see them, are only 1 inch, okay? So it's pretty important which one is going to be drier, which one's going to have better structural stability. Well, the one in the left-hand side actually has the pore space to allow that water to go down, okay? Now, here's something that I stuck in here because we're talking about compaction. This is something that I've learned, okay? A lot of guys will talk to me and say, well, my soils are cold and wet. And as soon as they say that, I instantly know what their problem was because they've described it to me, okay? And another guy will tell me, well, I've been long-term no-till. My soils are warm and moist. Wait, they're both no-tillers. One is cold and wet, and one guy says his soils are warm and moist. So what's going on? Well, it depends on the time frame, okay? The guy that's cold and wet, I instantly know that he has soil compaction or poor soil structure. Why is that? Because it takes 10 times more energy to warm up a soil that is saturated, okay? And so that tells me that he's got a saturated soils, it's cold and wet. If I put a cover crop in there and I get that water to drain, what's going to happen? That soil's going to warm up quicker because it takes less energy for that air to actually warm that soil. So that's year one. What about 2-3 years later? Well, then all of a sudden we start to get residue on the surface. What color is carbon when it starts to decompose? It turns black. And what happens to black colors? They absorb the heat. They're going to warm that soil. And then I have guys that say their soils are warm and moist. What's going on there? Well, now you're getting to that soil. Maybe you've got a little thicker layer of residue. A lot of times they're telling me, hey, the residue's gone. They have more biological activity. What happens in the middle of a compost pile? It warms up, okay? Roots have heat, and the microbes, they warm that soil up. So now we have the difference in no-till, cold and wet, a little bit warmer, but still maybe not perfect. And then we have warm and moist. Warm and moist is a perfect place to plant your corn, okay? That corn will come up, takes off really quick, and that's what we want, okay? So it all depends on your timeline, how long it's taking you to fix that problem. Well, I'm going to use some highly scientific terms. I'm going to use this again, okay? So let's take a look at this. Now, hopefully you guys will understand this. What do we see in the upper left-hand corner? How do they describe that soil? It's firm when it's wet. It's soft when it's dry. Now, hopefully you guys don't need a dictionary for this, but in the right-hand corner, it's squishy when it's wet. Everybody understand that term? Squishy or muddy when it's wet, and it turns to concrete when it's dry. Which of these scenarios do you guys want to be planning on this spring if we're going to be getting 30 or 50 to 60 inches of rainfall? The one in the left-hand corner is going to give you structural stability. So I have a challenge for everybody here, okay? Here's my challenge, because here's what the Maryland farmers have told me. They've been doing this for about 15 years now. And what did they tell me? We can get on our soils 5 to 10 days earlier than we used to because we're using cover crops. That tells me that they have good water infiltration and they're getting that water away. They have structural stability. So here's what I want you guys to do. I want you to take your best field of cover crops, and I want you to go out there and test it this year, because we're losing yield by not getting that cover crop planted a little bit earlier, okay? I want you to go out there and I want you to test it and try to get that field planted. Then I want you to report back to me how many of your neighbors got stuck because they tried to do the same thing on their conventional, and I'd appreciate it if you send me some pictures, because I'm going to put them on my website, okay? Because, you know, I'm getting a little tired of this. We get, a lot of times we go to the coffee shop, and these guys are making fun of us. Why don't we have a little bit of fun on their part, okay? So, yeah, see it happen, because this has actually happened. Guys have gotten stuck because they thought the neighbor can do it, I should be able to do it, and they actually do get stuck, okay? Now, transpiration rates. This is the key thing. What we've got is when we've got a live root, we've actually got water being sucked out of that. So internal plant characteristics are your root to shoot ratio. The more roots you have, the faster the water's going to go out. You also got to have a bigger leaf. So the more older that plant is, and also the leaf structure has a lot to do with that, okay? Internal factors, so basically more roots, larger leaf area, bigger plants. Thin leaves, those will evaporate more water. And then the less waxy they are, no hairs on that leaf, those all promote transpiration. So if you're trying to get your soil to dry out, look for those characteristics. We also have these external factors. You know, the temperature, the light, the humidity, the wind, those are things we can't control, okay? So how much can we lose? How much can you lose? Corn loses 54 liters per plant per day, so about 204 liters in 110 days. I converted that to you. That's about a half a gallon per day each plant uses. That's about 1.3 million gallons a year. What about cereal rye? The only thing you need to know there is that you're losing about a quarter on average to about a third of an inch if you've got a really good stand of cover crop out there that's living and growing. So it's going to depend on your plant density, your height, your genetics, all those factors, but at least it's someplace to start. That cover crop's doing you a lot of good. And it's also helping you with all these diseases, because what do these diseases love? Every one of these diseases love anaerobic conditions, saturated soils. So our mycorrhizae are out there. They're helping protect against anthracnose, Anthracnose, Fusarium, Pythium, Rhizoctonia, Phytophthora, Verticulum wilt, take-all disease. So once you have a cover crop out there, we're helping us with all these diseases that are causing a problem, especially in our soybeans, but also some of these will affect your corn also, all right? So how much is that going to cost you? Well, on Phytophthora, a 20% yield loss on 60 bushel beans, that's 12 bushel at $9. That could be over $100 an acre, okay? Now, these aren't exactly additive, but you can see that the costs are pretty high. And we can save some of that. We can add to our yield, and that's money we're putting back into our pocket. That's going to help you pay for a lot of cover crops, okay? This is kind of the take-home message to all this. Soil-borne diseases are the most damaging and when soil conditions are poor as a result of inadequate drainage, poor soil structure, low soil organic matter, low soil fertility, high soil compaction, okay? So that's what we're trying to take care of. Let's talk a little bit about this broken carbon-nitrogen cycle. You know, for a long time here, we didn't think that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium were related, okay? But now we're starting to see that there's a commonality among all these, especially with us guys in soil health. So what's the big one on nitrogen? When we have saturated soil conditions, what happens? We lose 40 to 60% of our nitrogen, okay? There's 1,000 pounds of nitrogen tied up in every 1% organic matter. And why is that so important? Because 80 to 90% of that is tied up organically, okay? So soil organic matter, or MOM, is really important. What about on phosphorus? If we can, well, first of all, if we can reduce the saturation in the soil, we can save nitrogen, okay? What about phosphorus? Well, phosphorus is one of those things that we're only about 10 to 50% efficient, 25% on average, and a lot of the phosphorus is tied up organically too. 90% of that phosphorus runoff occurs when? During the most intense rainfall events, okay? 30% comes over the surface, 70% comes by through the cracks, okay? Now, here's something I'll just jump ahead a little bit. Iron is our bad boy in the soil. Iron goes from ferric to ferrous, and when it does that, what happens? Under saturated anaerobic conditions, it releases soluble reactive phosphorus, okay? And then what happens? As soon as that soil dries out just a little bit, it will steal it from calcium and magnesium, and it will replenish it. That's why when Kevin King did his research in 2015, what did he find? As soon as he started doing his research, all the nitrogen, the concentration spiked really high because we got a lot of rain, and then it started to go down. That's because it was all gone, okay? What happened on phosphorus? Concentration stayed the same all summer long, didn't matter how much rain we got. Why was that? Because it went from ferric to ferrous, released its soluble reactive phosphorus, increased the concentration. As soon as that soil started to dry out, what happened? It stole it from the calcium, the magnesium. The next time it rained, it just repeated this cycle. We have a lot of phosphorus in our soil, okay? So now we know that both nitrogen and phosphorus are related under anaerobic conditions. What about potassium? How many people were here last year? Did you hear Steve Coleman up here? Steve was kind of scratching his head. He said, I don't know what's going on. He says, we've done this research the last 3 years. What did he tell us? He says, we took a soil test on potassium, and then what happened? We applied potassium fertilizer, and you would expect what? The soil test should go up. It went down. He says, we can't figure it out. I was sitting in the back row. I went up to Steve afterwards, and I said, Steve, I said, did you put that on in the fall? Yes. Did you use a vertical till tool? Yes. I said, did we have a wet fall? Well, yeah, the last 3 years have been wet. I says, you have phosphorus induction. What is phosphorus induction? That means under saturated soil conditions, the iron in the soil and the clay particles open up, and potassium is such a small ion, it gets caught, okay? It gets trapped. The only way you're going to release it is what? Microbially. Interesting thing, I've been looking at soil tests. 2012 was what? A dry year. What was our potassium levels in the soil? They were fairly high. In this case, about 275. I looked at it 3 years later, the exact same fields, they were down to about 100. 2015 was an excessively wet year. And I'm looking at all these soil tests, and it's a regular pattern that's going on, okay? So now we know what? Under saturated soil conditions, nitrogen, phosphorus are lost, okay? And under saturated soil conditions, potassium is tied up, okay? So that's an important thing that we need to know. We need to use more MOM, okay? Soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is like your mom. She buffers pH. She buffers soil temperatures, okay? She gives you that blanket so you're not too hot, so too cold. It feeds your plants, okay? It increases our water holding capacity so she can give you a drink of water, okay? She improves the water infiltration, okay? So you don't have a leaky diaper, okay? She's changing your diaper, whatever. Water and nutrient runoff decreases, okay? The more organic matter we put in our soils, the better they're going to be, okay? So that's what we're looking at. And also, soil organic matter is a chelator. This just goes back to a little bit on the nitrogen. Look at the losses that we're getting. 5 to 50% with volatilization. Leaching is 20 to 40, denitrification. What are we doing when we have these bacteria in the soil? We're on average, we're getting 20 pounds. But now when we're putting under anaerobic conditions and we're using some of this static compost, we can get up to 100 pounds of nitrogen for free. Okay, so we're starting to do a little research on that static. Or you can do a legume crop and get maybe up to 50 to maybe as much as 200 pounds. Okay, at 40 cents a pound, that's worth about $20 to $80. All right, these are the best forms. These are my 4 R's. This is something I learned this last year. The best form of nitrogen, what's the right rate? Put on 40 to 60 pounds of nitrogen in the spring. Why do we need to do it early? Because the temperatures are cold and the microbial levels are at their lowest level. What source do we want to use? Well, the best one would be proteins or amino acids. Most of the time we're not going to do that. They're too expensive. But what would be the worst form? Nitrates are the worst, then use ammonium, and if you can, try liquid urea. Now, liquid urea isn't sold very commonly. It's a little bit cold, but try it. You'll get better nitrogen uptake by that plant. Where's the right place? Put it below ground. Put it in a 2x2 or 2x4. You don't want to put it on the soil surface because the residue will tie it up, okay? And then the right time to do it's early spring at planting on corn when the microbes are at their lowest level. So a little bit on nitrogen. Here's a pop quiz on phosphorus, okay? Looks like I'm going to have to speed it up here. This is some information that I'm a little upset about because unfortunately there are people that are telling you the wrong thing at some of these meetings. I've been to a number of H2O meetings and I don't like sometimes the message that they're telling. Here's the situation. I want you to take this quiz. If cereal rye had 5 inches of water runoff, and let's say the concentration was 20% higher than the bare soil, okay? The bare soil has 8 inches of water runoff, but 20% lower concentration. So let's just say that the bare soil is 1 part per million phosphorus and the cereal rye is 1.2. Which field, the cover crop or the bare field, had the lowest phosphorus load? Okay, that's the amount of phosphorus that's going to leave that field. Do you have enough information? The answer is you got part of the information. So let's see what the right answer is. So the equation is very simple. I worked on a PhD on this, okay? So phosphorus concentration times runoff volume equals going to give you your total pounds of phosphorus, your load that's being lost, plus the concentration in the sediment times the sediment load. So let's take a look at that. A little bit extra information. What's the average erosion rate for Ohio? Let's just use that, 2.6 on a bare soil. Now, what would the cereal rye do? Well, on average, you might only have maybe a ton, less than a ton, maybe a half a ton. But let's just use a ton. It makes the math easy, okay? So on the conventional water, 8 inches times 1 part per million is 8. On the cereal rye, 5 inches times 1.2 parts per million is 6. Is 8 higher than 6? It just shows you that in this particular case, the guy that was presenting it said, well, since the concentration's 20% higher, the cover crop's not doing its job. The answer is no, it is doing its job. You got to look at both sides of the equation. Now, what it's telling us is, hey, the cover crops in both cases helping us with sediment. It's also helping us with the amount of soluble reactive phosphorus. I just put this one up here because when we're dealing with manure, I always like to use this example. Do you realize that we had 60 million buffalo in this country in the 1800s? And the answer is, did they stop eating or pooping in the wintertime? The answer is no. Did we have a water quality problem? No. So let's learn a lesson from those buffalo. Number one, do what? Apply your manure thin. Number two, apply it to a live crop, because that live crop will instantly absorb a lot of this manure. I see in a lot of cases that we're putting in these big manure structures, and what we're doing is we're storing that manure for what? 6 months. Then what do? We put all that manure out the first day of April. What happens when the farmer, if it's fit to be out there, what are they doing? They're spreading their manure out, and then any day that they can spread manure, they're spreading manure. And then what happens? 2-3 inch rain. What happens to all that manure? All gone in one shot. We got to start thinking like Mother Nature, applying this manure to a live crop, okay? That's going to help us. This real quick goes over the phosphorus speciation. I've already done this. We're going to skip ahead. But iron goes from ferric to ferrous. It's going to release phosphorus under saturated soil conditions, okay? These are the key things that are going on. The weather has changed. Our fertilizer chemistry has changed a little bit. We have phosphorus now, the type that we're using is a little more soluble, but the big thing has been vertical tillage. That vertical tillage is creating a compaction zone about 2 to 3 inches down. That's causing anaerobic conditions. We have less soil organic matter, and probably the biggest change that we've had is acid rain. Now our rain is a lot more alkaline. So when the water is very acid, it holds on to phosphorus very tightly. Well, that has changed from 4.2 to 5.2, and most recently now it's up to 6.2. That's a factor of 100 times more alkaline. So iron is just barely holding on to this phosphorus, and under those alkaline conditions, more alkaline conditions, it's going to release soluble reactive phosphorus. It's not really maybe as much as what you guys are doing. It's a lot has to do with the weather and the change, because we're cleaning up the atmosphere. We're actually making more soluble reactive phosphorus available, which brings up a point. If we have more soluble reactive phosphorus in the soil, especially 20% more with the cover crop, do we need to fertilize for phosphorus? My answer would be you can greatly cut back, if not eliminate, a lot more of your phosphorus. Now, it's going to depend on your soil test, and you're going to have to look at your yields, but a lot of folks are cutting way back on the phosphorus because it is more soluble, it is more available, and even Steve Coleman will tell you we don't need as much as what we thought, okay? I have about 15 minutes left. Here's what's going on with that vertical tillage. It's creating this new compaction zone. We're going to skip through these really quick, but these are really nice pictures. So we can do that. And that's creating this anaerobic zone. That's hurting our nitrogen, our phosphorus, and our potassium. Okay? So let's take a look. Why are we having this problem? Because we don't have live roots in the soil. Those live roots do what? They give us soluble, a lot more microbes, and those microbes are just soluble bags of fertilizer. Okay? A lot of people are really dishing the no-till because in this case, if you look at the no-till, there's a big macropore there. It seems like all that phosphorus might go right down to your tile. How do you fix that problem? You put a live root in there. Live roots do what? They absorb soluble nitrogen, soluble phosphorus, okay? That helps take it. This is research that came out of Indiana where we had vertical tillage. We had 3 times higher soluble reactive phosphorus than we did the long-term no-till. What about on the total phosphorus? Again, 3 times higher, okay? Sounding like a broken record. What about sediment? Well, it did change the sediment loads. 5 times higher where we had vertical tillage versus long-term no-till. I'm here to tell you as a water quality specialist, if you guys were to control the majority of your soil erosion, we would have a ton less problems with the water quality. A lot of that water quality issues are related to the soil erosion, okay? That part that's floating off is the sediment. How bad is it? We're working on a grant in Toledo Harbor. 800,000 cubic yards of sediment is being dredged out of the harbor in one spot, okay, one major area. That's 40,000 semi-loads of material, okay, and that came off of our farms. Has an average of $30 of nitrogen in it per acre that we're losing, and about $8.60 in phosphorus, okay? Let's keep it on the land, all right? Here are a couple other real quick pictures. Come on. All right, I'm going to skip this one. Let's go to these pictures. Here's a 2-inch downpour. It happened in about 3-4 years ago. We have 3 fields. Field 1 is conventional. Field 2 is conventional. Field 3 is a no-till field with cereal rye. So we got 2.5 inches of water. Just came down right after Christmas, just downpour. This is what it looks like. Look at the level of that water. Look how muddy it is, okay? A lot of sediment going into that stream, okay? Here's what it looks like. Look at the level of that ditch. Very high, fast water moving, okay? Here's the second field, conventional. The residue, there's a catch basin in here, okay? When that water is brown like that, it is full of nutrients, it's full of soil, okay? Whoop, come back, come on. Here is the conventional field, okay? But look at the level in that field. And you can see in the left-hand corner, something weird's going on because that water is clear, all right? Here's clear water coming off this cereal rye field. And there's the clear water going into that. And notice the level of the water in that ditch. We're not getting that flashiness, okay? The water's coming off slower, and it's a lot clearer, okay? If you want visual evidence that the cover crops works, right there it is, okay? So that's the best thing. I'm going to skip these because I want to get to some other things. Yield is the last thing that's going to go up. Okay, what you need to do, first of all, this came from the Soil Health Division. The first thing that you're going to see is your active carbon will go up in your soil. That's your organic matter. That's what I call the young mom, okay? That's what we need to get our soil so that they're fully functioning again, okay? Then you're going to see your aeration will be better. You'll see less standing water. You'll get the water to go down. And then over time, all of a sudden, then the yield will start to come back, okay? But don't expect yield to go up first. Yield will be the last thing generally that goes up. All these other changes have to happen first before you're going to see an improvement in your soil health. These are 2 soils. This came from Dave Brandt's farm. The one on the right is a degraded soil. Most of us, unfortunately, are probably farming degraded soils. That farm over there had tillage for 75 to 100 years, okay? What about that soil on the left? 50 feet away, Dave Brandt's farm, long-term no-till, about 20 years, okay? He farmed it the same way till about 20 years ago, started using cover crops, okay? So the difference between a degraded soil and a fully functioning soil is the organic matter and the soil health, okay? It's possible to make these changes in 10 or 15, 20 years, in most of our lifetimes, okay? And why do I bring this up? Most of our research, folks, have been done on degraded soils. Are degraded soils going to give us the answers we need? The answer is no. Most research, 95%, is not being done on fully functioning soils. These fully functioning soils are going to act differently. They're going to give us different answers. And that's why, unfortunately, we really need to go back and redo this research, because this is the exact same soil type. Although it's really not anymore. He has changed it so much. The one on the left is turning into a mollisol. It has high organic matter. The one on the right is highly degraded, okay? So it has changed the actual soil. You can do that within your lifetime. All right, so I think I've covered most of what I wanted to. Come on, what's wrong with you? We might need a new battery because it's not working. All right, I just got to really push on it. I'm just going to wrap up here. We're going to do One last thing, then we'll take 1 or 2 questions. There's 4 to 5 things that you need to do to make your soils fully functioning. And, you know, we're all got this virus on our hands, and we're all a little bit worried. I will recommend you guys do the soap at the end. But rather than doing the handshake, why don't you try this? Introduce yourself and teach somebody these 4 principles. So this is what I call the soil health handshake. Principle number 1, what is it? Minimize soil disturbance. Why do we want to do that? Because when that rain hits that ground, that soil will jump up 2 feet and it'll travel 4 feet, okay? Especially if you got a slope, okay? So we want to protect that soil surface. Principle number 2 is what? Maximize your surface residue and your above ground residue, because when that rain comes down, it'll cushion it, plus it allows that water to infiltrate slowly into the soil. Number 3, and this is probably the most important, maximize live roots. Why do we want to maximize live roots? Roots do what? They increase the pore space, they allow live roots, they spread that water out so it can be treated. Live roots do what? They absorb soluble nitrogen, soluble phosphorus, and what else do live roots do? They build your soil organic matter, okay, and your biology in your soil. Okay, what's principle number 4? Maximize your biodiversity. So this is above ground, this is the below ground. Crop rotations, putting in different root structures, all those things are going to help us with disease, insects, pests, all the different pests, the weeds that we have. If you do those 4 things, what will happen? You'll improve soil health, and if you want to learn more, where do you go? You go to Unlocking the Secrets of the Soil. So that's kind of my soil health handshake. Hopefully you enjoy that. If we have any questions, I'll take them. I think we got about 5 minutes. Any questions? If you got questions about how we're going to handle this preventative planting, I will tell you this, with the H2O program, you got to be a little bit careful with one thing. If you're going to put out the cover crops, what's going to happen? You got to have your manure and you got to have your fertilizer on before October 15th. A lot of guys are getting caught by that. How easy is it going to be for us to get cover crops planted by October 15th? Going to be a little tough. We're either going to have to fly them on, use a high boy, or we're going to have to use earlier maturing corn and soybean varieties, okay? So you're going to have to think about that. If you're going to get into that program, you cannot broadcast fertilizer after October 15th if you're using a cover crop and you're getting paid. All right, any questions? Anybody? Yes, over there. Yes. So here's what happens with the potassium. When Steve was up here, and what happens is the clay particles under saturated soil conditions, they actually expand, and especially iron. It's an iron complex. I don't fully understand it myself, but I read it in a geology book. And what happens is it expands, and when it does that, because potassium is such a small ion, it gets caught and encased in your clay. And that's why he couldn't understand it. He says, we know we put this potassium on. We're not finding it in the tile water. It's still in your soil. It's just tightly hung up in that clay particle. The only way you're going to release that, the potassium is. Yeah, and the only way you're going to release that is maybe if the soil dries out and it cracks, it will release it, but also probably it's got to be aerobic conditions and the microbes will make that potassium available again. But they've done it for the last 3 years, and they've seen every time they put on potassium fertilizer, they start out at this level, they put on a certain amount of potassium, they would expect the level to go up, and instead the last 3 years it's gone down every single time. Again, vertical tillage, wet soils, anaerobic conditions, you're creating conditions that's going to tie up your nutrients. Tying up, you're going to lose nitrogen, you're going to lose phosphorus, and you're going to tie up your potassium. Cover crops are going to have to be part of that solution.